Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. Welcome to all our listeners, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at Cybersauna. Advanced persistent threats, or APTs, are generally seen as the sort of apex predator in the cyber threat landscape. And while they are certainly noteworthy, their reputation can distort what makes them unique and what they may have in common with other adversaries. Today we're joined by threat intelligence analyst Stephen Robinson and security consultant Richard Suls to shed some light on APTs and how we can protect ourselves against them. So let me start off with something simple. What is an APT? What's the definition?
So an APT is an advanced persistent threat. It's a type of cyber attack campaign, which people sometimes get confused with the idea that it's actually a group. It's actually a type of campaign or attack. It involves a highly skilled and motivated group of hackers or attackers who gain unauthorized access or are attempting to gain unauthorized access to a network, system, or otherwise, and remain undetected for an extended period of time.
Okay.
You might think of them as not your run-of-the-mill script kiddies. They're kind of the ninjas of the hacking world, if you will, and typically their primary goal is to steal information rather than cause damage. And they can spend months or even years trying to achieve that.
I guess we should point out that the advanced is more about operational advanced. They might not be using the latest and coolest zero-day weird ninja hacks. They might use those as well, but they'll just use any tool that will get the job done, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's been an interesting thing recently that advanced persistent threat label, which used to be kind of a coded way of saying, a nation state sponsored actor, is now quite well applied to ransomware groups. Essentially, we're talking about that persistent, i.e. a persistent threat that will keep trying to get access to what they want. And I think it's interesting what Richard said about that typically they're going after information. If you look at North Korea, for example, we've got those actors who are doing espionage, who are going after national or industrial secrets, but also some of the biggest thefts ever.
Like cryptocurrency thefts.
Exactly, yeah. Whether of crypto or traditional currency. So it's something where I don't think we can necessarily classify them even by their motivations anymore. And like you said, that technological thing, they don't necessarily have to be technologically advanced. The most efficient attacker or the most efficient attack is the one that works.
Yeah, that's the scary part to me. Like, let's say I'm seeing some absolute script kiddie level entry things in my systems and fine, then there's a month's downtime and then somebody else comes in using similar techniques. Now, is this just script kiddies messing around and then they got distracted by something else for a minute? Or did the access just get sold to somebody else who's now using sort of the lowest possible tool set to get in?
Yeah, the initial access broker, that's selling on access, that's a big thing. And, you constantly, when you see a compromise, happening, you've got to wonder what's the end goal. But you can't tell by that initial access anymore.
Yeah.
I wrote something up recently where it wasn't a particularly interesting incident, really, because it was just some ransomware. But it was a ransomware group. It sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. A ransomware group, a nation-state actor, an initial access broker, and a cryptojacking gang all used the exact same exploit method to get access to the victim. Also, unrelated, someone inside the victim 2 weeks earlier had clicked on an Emotet phishing email. And so, look at it from the beginning, no way of knowing who the actors were if you can't attribute the infrastructure there. So you don't know what they're going to do. Yeah, so it's very true.
So do you mean you're rolling incident response in an environment that's being popped by absolutely everybody out there?
Yeah, the popularity of, mass exploitation these days. So cryptojacking gangs are often seen as not very technologically advanced, yeah? Just get in and drop a crypto miner and as many types of persistence as they can and leave again, not doing anything particularly advanced. But there's reports that some of these not very advanced gangs have 30,000 bots, in their networks mining at any one time.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. I just wrapped up an incident response with a client here with Secure where they had a website that had been completely devastated. The logs did not go far back enough to indicate the initial point of compromise, but when we started to investigate further, there were no less than 4 different groups, probably mostly script kiddies, but folks that, individuals or groups that had figured out that this site had been compromised. It initially had been something that was just serving up ads, and then it was somebody figured, or a bot figured out that it had been compromised, and it was easy enough to place another web shell on there. At the end of the day, we found something like 12 different web shells with different languages in them. So we knew that it had probably, multiple, maybe not nation states, but multiple actors from various parts of the globe had used that site for various nefarious purposes.
That's awesome. Okay, so if you can't tell APTs, apart from the other organizations by their tools and stuff, going back to the definitions a little bit, so what sort of behavior or, other criteria distinguish these groups from other threats?
So I would suggest that some of the things that distinguish them are, as we have already mentioned, their level of sophistication, their desire to remain in the shadows, or their stealthiness, their persistence.
Yeah.
You see APTs using highly tailored or highly targeted, tailor-made ways to attack their targets. So they do a lot of research beforehand. They may use specific tactics to breach specific types of organizations or industries, even for that matter. In addition to that, what I think we see on average is that they tend not to be causing chaos, right? They're more about specific targets, specific results. We see them using things like social engineering, custom malware, zero-day exploits. And again, they're very patient.
I think that it is, as I say, it can be hard to tell sometimes, but that social engineering thing, I think you've really, hit on a good marker there, because obviously that requires a certain amount of research on their part. If you're targeting an area, a geography or whatever, to have that, that customized approach. And I think the persistence is still a really good way of identifying it, because if you've got someone who's using, the simplest tools and methods they can for, their attack, if they don't work, if you've got a low-level actor, oh well, they'll just try somewhere else.
Yeah.
If you've got someone who's got the resources, that they're going to keep escalating.
Right.
And I think that's something is that you see the interesting stuff when they hit a brick wall. Sure, maybe they can do a nice easy exploit and get in just like any other actor, but where someone else might be put off by an air gap, for example, an APT will find a way around it.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you make a good point too, is that a lot of the non-APT groups will just kind of try and find the low-hanging fruits, whereas APTs tend to have missions, whether they're state-sponsored or they're motivated by money or something else. They are going for results, specific results, not for who can we hit today. So that kind of brings up an APT that I thought was fantastic and terrible, of course, at the same time, was the Equation Group. And we haven't heard a lot from them lately, but they had some really fascinating ways of attacking individuals. They're tied to hard drive firmware malware, for instance, which is incredibly advanced and practically impossible to remove. Also practically impossible to detect.
Quite terrifying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we're starting to mention some names already. What are some of the more active APTs that we're seeing out there at this moment?
So one of the things that we find is that APT groups are very secretive and they don't like to reveal their identities. So it's important to focus on their tactics and techniques in order to try and classify them. Sometimes we may see that researchers or organizations will give an APT group one name, and then another researcher or organization will give the same group another name. And of course, a lot of these groups aren't just coming up out of the woodwork and saying, hey, this was us. So some of the groups that we're aware of are APT 28, known as Fancy Bear, the Lazarus Group, APT 41, the Equation Group that I mentioned, which we're pretty confident have ties to the NSA at this point, but of course nobody can quite verify that. Stephen, do you have any others that I didn't mention that you wanted to bring up?
So, yeah, I think we hit a lot of the kind of traditional homes there with the sort of Chinese aligned, Russian aligned, and there's been a lot of lines blurring there as APTs take part in the kind of underground economy that's been going on. So, as the ransomware groups and the IABs kind of make things easier, we have seen, or has been reports of nation-state APTs purchasing access, just like other attackers, and that kind of that does blur the lines. Before you might be able to go, okay, this group is using plug X, thus we can assume that they are whatever. And obviously there's still strong indicators, but I think we all have to try and second guess a bit more. I'd say one of the ones I'd describe as probably an APT that's been quite active recently is going to be, say, Lockbit. The ransomware groups. Any one of the kind of Conti inheritors who've picked up the shards that kind of fell from there. I definitely put those on the list because we've talked about that persistence, and there's reporting and it's out there of actors going onto underground forums and going, I'm looking to purchase access to a company with a minimum turnover of $100 million or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because those are like, we know for a fact that whether or not they get some tasking from intelligence agencies, we know that those organizations are criminal in origin. Like, unlike, for example, Fancy Bear, Richard, which you mentioned, which, I think there's been CCTV footage of the specific intelligence officers typing keyboards. So we have a pretty good idea who's behind those attacks. But there's also some actual nations that are punching well above their weight in this game. Like, I'm thinking, I can't name any Vietnamese products, but I can name Ocean Lotus, who's very closely attributed to Vietnam.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there are certainly nation states that have these groups where they haven't been identified in the slightest. And I don't want to pick on any specific place, but so I'll name a few of them, but we haven't seen, any APTs specifically coming out of Israel, but we know that they have a very robust cyber defense force, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And we know that Korea has APTs, China has APTs. We know that Russia has APTs that are state-sponsored, of course. Obviously, the U.S. as well, and probably most of Europe. It's probably worth noting at this time that the APTs that we don't hear about are the most successful ones, of course.
Yeah, exactly. They're the ones who are achieving their goals without it getting splashed across the front pages. With the nation-state APTs, that attribution, obviously sometimes you get lucky, like with, say, APT-1 is the famous one, or you mentioned the CCTV images, which remind me of, is it Chengdu 404?
Yeah.
The Chinese technology company. But a lot of the kind of the attribution, when you see a new campaign and you look at the geographical distribution of it, if you've got someone who's hacking a lot of Southeast Asia and has not done anything in China, you kind of look at that and go, well,
who benefits? Yeah, exactly. We also touched on something that frustrates me to no end is that all these different names and naming conventions. Now, I get, Richard, what you were saying, that it's hard to identify, is this the same group? Is this a different group? Attribution in general can be a little bit iffy, but like, why can't we as an industry just like sit down and decide on a naming convention and just, this is how well it's going to be from now on?
Well, I think we've seen that in tech in general, what we need to do is create an alliance of organizations and governments that agree to a standard, and then we could do that. It just doesn't seem like naming these groups is a very high priority, as opposed to, say, identifying and stopping or blocking them.
I'd say there's two reasons why we don't have a unified naming convention. One of them is handily summed up by, I think, an XKCD comic about standards.
Yeah, okay.
And someone stands up and goes, we need to standardize this 14 different ways of doing this thing. 5 minutes later, there are 15 different ways of doing this thing. And then, dare I say it, there's a lot of marketing,
True.
If you've got your naming convention, then when someone searches up that particular group, you're going to come up first. And I think that's got to be some of it. Yes, you need to have a name. If you're doing, if you're working on something and it's not public or published yet, you need to give it, a temporary name.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously. So you can't coordinate that necessarily. But I think at least that once something is out there, if someone has named it, if one organization has given it a name, other people tend to follow suit, or at least reference it. But it is like, there's some, Malpedia pages that just go on and on and on with lists of names that we just don't need.
No, I get what you're saying, Richard, about sort of naming not being a priority, but still, I mean, we need these names just for the shorthand, for like, so we don't have to talk about all the TTPs every time we mention a group. We can just say this group, what they're like. And speaking of groups and knowing what they're like, I understand, Stephen, that your team recently analyzed a Lazarus Group campaign targeting medical research organizations. Can you talk about that a little bit? What are some of the lessons defenders can take from that example?
Yeah, we did. It was quite interesting. We got to see quite a lot of Lazarus Group, or this section of Lazarus Group's behaviors. And it was one where they gained access in a pretty standard fashion, mass exploitation, vulnerable device. And what we think happened, obviously you can't prove it, is that they are doing kind of opportunistic mass exploitation. And then essentially they stop and look at what they've got. And if it's not of value, they incorporate it into a sort of relay network of infrastructure that they have. Sort of like a free VPN. And if it is of value, then they go hard on it. And something that I think reinforces that, so that's something that we think we saw, is that it was mass exploitation, but they'd found, this medical supplier, and that was a technology that they were interested in. If you look at the 3CX compromise, they said now that appears to have come from somebody working at 3CX installing a Trojanized crypto trading software application. And Trojanized crypto-related applications are so heavily a Lazarus Group thing, a North Korean thing, because all you gotta do is get in, wait until there's a wallet address being written, and rewrite the wallet address to yours, and suddenly you've got the money, and no one can do anything. And so that sounds so very much like an opportunistic, they were just spewing this Trojanized software around all over the place, and then they just saw something ping back and decided they could do more.
Yeah, okay.
That's one of the things for Lazarus Group to bear in mind, is that their behavior, and maybe this is something for all APTs now, considering IABs, access brokers, their behavior can really start from a normal, quote, normal compromise, and then just escalate to hundreds of gigs of sensitive data being taken.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on something that you mentioned, Stephen. We saw open source software being compromised, such as like VideoLAN, for instance, VLC, which so many people use. And Chinese APT, we're fairly sure as of last year that it was a Chinese APT that caused that.
Yeah, LastPass was one that struck, close to my heart.
Yeah.
When they were compromised, and that's the supply chain attack, essentially. I think it's a bit up in the air for me if a supply chain attack has to be intentionally targeted. You compromise a supplier of your intended target,
right? Or
if it's an opportunistic.
Any kind of pivot makes it a supply chain attack.
I think that's where we're going now, simply because with such huge suppliers, as you say, VLC, where would you not find that?
Yeah, but also, like, I feel that a password manager has got to be like the ultimate supply chain attack. Like, what do you need access? You got all this access right here, like people's credentials, and just go for it.
Yeah, and as well as LastPass, I was writing some stuff up on interesting kind of attacks last year. And one that came up again and again and again was Okta. And you just have to look at their business model. And realize that, they are a prime target. And I kept seeing the name come up, and not saying, that they did anything wrong. Because sometimes, for some places, you can say they did something wrong. But, as far as I could tell, Okta was doing everything right, but they must have just been getting hammered because they are a juicy target.
Absolutely. So do we have any idea about how quickly APT groups are detected, or how long they get to sort of live off the land in companies or organizations' estates?
What we don't have is any kind of indication of the average time that a threat actor or an APT is allowed to linger in an organization, in a network, or a compromised space. What we do know, however, is that there are a lot of techniques, Eternal Blue, for instance, which have been available to APTs or a threat actor for years. In the case of Eternal Blue, we're not entirely sure how far it goes back, but we know that it came to light around 2018 and that it had been in use at least as far back as 2012.
So from a defender's perspective, if you're one of those companies who absolutely has APTs in their threat model, and that's what you want to defend against, how is that different from dealing with if you're a company that might not have APTs in their threat model?
So protecting a network or an organization from an APT kind of requires a more holistic and proactive approach than dealing with other threats. It would include implementing strong security controls, monitoring for suspicious activity, conducting regular security assessments, penetration testing, and addressing known vulnerabilities. Organizations need to have a clear IR, incident response plan, in place to quickly detect, contain, and mitigate APT attacks. And to contrast dealing with other threats like ransomware gangs or hacktivists, it may require more emphasis on preventative measures such as endpoint protection and secure backups, for instance.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like maybe if an APT gets access to your network because they've got a goal and they've got resources, they can push that door wide open really quickly. Whereas, if it's a less resourced attacker or a less aware attacker, you maybe got a bit more leeway to defend on. But that, I think the defense against an APT really is still defense in depth, or as we call it these days, the zero trust model.
Okay, so basic cyber hygiene, so no magic bullets or anything like that.
For me, who watches the watcher?
Yeah, exactly.
Your other watcher and your other detection mechanism.
But you also touched on something I wanted to talk to you guys about, like you've had experience of seeing what an APT attack looks like from very close. So it must be just given that the P stands for persistence, it must be just an absolute nightmare to evict one of these guys from an estate. Am I correct?
We're both nodding.
You're both nodding. That's it. Nothing to add. Yeah, it is a nightmare.
Well, so one thing that we've touched upon but haven't outright said is that these APTs are actually generally well-funded or have stolen cryptocurrency in the past. And so what they have is access to these dark web markets where if they have gained access to an organization, but they need more leverage or more ability to knock down other doors internally, they can go out and buy that. They don't have to create the wheel every time.
Yeah.
You can buy phishing as a service. You can buy so many things as a service out there that they could leverage and throw at. And for example, I think there were some examples of this in kind of recent incidents where there was a minor quote compromise where some data was stolen. And if you've got someone who's persistent and who knows what they've got, they can easily twist that into another tool against you. If you've got detail, even if you've just got someone's mailbox or calendar, you can start sending phishing that is related to things that are actually happening. And really turn this simple a simple bit of access into something more.
Yeah, and again, the persistence part and the operational advance were sort of, these people understand their targets and they know, and they can spend that time to research, like, this is how these people communicate, these are the sort of the social networks in here, and then sort of hit those. And I don't know, it's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, it's an interesting slight curveball example was Bian Lian, I think I've pronounced it correctly, who in their recent threats against companies to get their ransom paid were quoting the exact legislation around what the company risked if they didn't pay the ransomware. If it got out, if the data got leaked, exactly what GDPR version, this, that, the other, or whatever country they were in. And they were different for each one. They weren't just a blanket. They knew who they were talking to and they knew what would hit them in the wallet.
brilliant and
Yeah.
terrifying.
Yes.
And that brings up something that's kind of on the fringe of this, is that I believe that LLMs like ChatGPT are going to start being leveraged by these groups. And they can very easily just say, what is the risk to a Danish company if PII is released?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a very low-hanging fruit for these organizations to then threaten the companies that they're targeting or the other organizations that they're targeting with, the big stick that's not even wielded by the threat actor or the APT.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
And it's a definite power of those tools is to turn, simple intent into clear communication. And I think we've all seen ransomware notes that were not examples of clear communication. And, to be able to apply that pressure.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So to talk about geopolitics a little bit, we know that some of these groups are either directly associated to a nation state or sort of operate with sort of nation state looking conveniently the other way. How far should we hold these countries and governments responsible for APT attacks?
It's a good question. There are situations where I think it's more environmental. I remember a stat about, Romania had a disproportionately large e-crime, ecosystem. But Romania also had invested hugely in broadband and high-tech jobs.
Right.
And so, it was just the dark twin. You've got a lot of people with these skills. You're going to have more, e-crime. But then you've got other situations where the country is very much not just creating an environment where, it can happen, but is pushing it. And so obviously Russia has got that strange relationship going on between organized crime and government, where not only is there the blind eye, but there are links supposedly between Fin7 and, the Russian government. China has had the interesting patriotic hackers, which gives me the chance to mention my favorite hacking group, the Honker Union, which I just love the name, which was patriotic hackers. And you can see, or you could see back in the day at least, that there was a sort of, you'd have an actor who'd started out just doing literal script kiddie, defacement, China's great, you suck stuff. But sometimes you could see those handles of, being used with evolving layers and levels of activity until it was, there was a definite Chinese state APT, and it was these people being recruited in. And I think there were even records of hacking competitions being held and sponsored by the Chinese state, which just happened to coincide with, APT surges and spikes. And I think it's very hard, and this is the thing that I think states have found, is that it is very hard for them to be held accountable for the behaviors of these groups, because even if you can get a very, very strong identification of the people behind, what is another state going to do about it?
Right.
What is going to be the actual consequences of those actions? And I think that there's not been much cyber warfare now, where you've had physical, real world results of a nation state's activities. I think that would get a definite response, but simply when it remains in that cyber space out of the real world, I think it's become apparent that people are not going to be held accountable for that.
You touched on something really important, Stephen, is that we're really, again, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast, these groups aren't taking credit for things. So we're really analyzing what's happening and attributing results to the groups, attributing attacks, attributing the type of command and control infrastructure or tactics and techniques that they're using to these groups. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from these groups. And one of the oldest spy tricks in the book is to make it look like it's coming from somewhere else, right? So
yeah,
it could be fairly easy, for instance, to grab a bank of IP addresses in China and make it look like your, APT is coming right out of China when it could be coming out of North Korea, or it could be coming out of Iceland.
Yeah.
My apologies to Iceland, of course.
Yeah.
And setting your keyboard language to to Russian, or for example, there was some good examples of was it the Commonwealth of Independent States, which were the post-Soviet republics, and there was that thing where Russian and other states like that, organized crime gangs wouldn't target Commonwealth of Independent States, and so they had exclusion lists of if it's this country, don't detonate. And really, from an espionage / major actors perspective, if you put that exclusion list on your software, you're probably not going to miss out on much, so you could very easily make it look like you're just some random organized crime gang by doing that. But this does bring up the No Pineapple report that we did recently, and where we found that the actor had connected from North Korean IP space. And as you say, if that's Chinese IP space, that's not telling you very much. But I believe North Korea has 700 and something IP addresses in total.
Yeah.
So in that case, when we had that connection, it's a lot more likely that it is North Korea. The Occam's razor there is saying, well, the Korean state controls all IP addresses. It's probably the Korean state. Whereas if it's China, obviously America.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, that's where this question started. Like in some cases, like attribution is hard, sure, but in some cases you do kind of know who's behind the attack. So Stephen, you had a good point. So what do you do? Like, even if you know for a fact that this is a North Korean operation, for example, North Korea, like, what kind of sanctions could we impose against them that we haven't already? And also, like, there's been espionage, like, as long as there have been states, and that's just like, well, it's one of those things. So do we think that nation-state-backed APT groups are just another one of those things, and that's just the nature of the beast from here on out?
Unfortunately, what stops a nation-state from saying, you're right, this group is operating within our boundaries, but they're a rogue intelligence group. They have nothing to do with us, and, we can't even control them ourselves. And whether that's true or not, they're now off the hook based on that statement, right?
Yeah, and I get the feeling that if you can attribute a group and you can go, this is a very highly skilled, APT group operating out of whatever that we think are probably some intelligence service. If you can attribute them in that way, I think the country probably isn't going to care. But if you can attribute them by saying these are a bunch of muppets who shouldn't be allowed near a keyboard, that's going to probably not look good, because there's a lot of this kind of posturing and so on about capability. You think about military posturing, it's kind of the same thing. They want to boast about their capabilities and they want to have respect, bargaining chips, etc. But the question of attribution, what does it do? It's kind of something that we've been discussing for a while. What does attribution do? If you've just been hacked by somebody, do you care who did it, or do you care what they did?
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. But on the other side of this equation, we're talking about these nation-state groups, or, other APTs as well, but nation-state groups attacking Finland, for example. That's in the headlines. Now, there's no Finland in the cyberspace. There's just individual networks of individual organizations. So if we're being attacked by a nation state, what role do nation states have on the defense side?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, really, it comes down to, well, you can modify the behavior of the attackers by, changing the risk and reward, or you can also modify the behavior of the defenders, whether through regulation. So a lot of countries are putting into place regulations that require a certain level of security, essentially, to be implemented. But also, can countries, can they simply help? Is there more that can be done?
So I would suggest that governments can help by increasing their investments in cybersecurity research and development.
Training.
Promoting international cooperation, information sharing, and as Stephen said, developing standards essentially for responsible behavior in cyberspace, right? And also larger governments, more influential governments could typically use their diplomatic channels to hold other governments accountable for cybersecurity and for cyber attacks, and ideally start to promote some international laws and norms
it does seem like the norm now is that nation-state APT actors are out there targeting organizations and other states at will, it seems. And so there is that intergovernmental diplomatic, channel and back and forth, and there needs to be use of that between countries, because as an organization you can't it's the issue with an APT is as an organization you can't stop them being persistent. But maybe a country can say to another, all right, look, we know that you're doing this, to this country, this company, whatever, knock it off. Whether it'll work or not, I don't know.
Yeah, but like going beyond just saying knock it off, like let's say you're a major big Western country, or call it a union of states, and your critical oil pipeline infrastructure gets hit by another nation state, and you just happen to have both civilian and military cyber capabilities in your country. What point do you sort of hack back?
Well, I think that what is very interesting to note is that a lot of these attacks or responses don't make any kind of news or headlines. So if this hypothetical nation of states in the West had a hypothetical oil pipeline that was hacked, the likelihood is that any kind of response is not going to make the news.
So the successes are secret, and failures are public.
Very much so in this status, or in this at this current time. Yeah.
I mean, because if you think about it, the response is a response going to be against the kind of the sponsor, against the state, as it were, or if you were to just swap back and take out all of that group's infrastructure, well, no one would know if that happened apart from the group.
True.
Obviously, there's been the sort of the issuing of arrest warrants of particular people being arrested or named, and I do wonder how effective that is.
Actually, Stephen, you bring up something interesting. We've seen at least one case where an APT group was infiltrated and their secrets shared with the public.
Yeah.
I also kind of like the recent thing where a Russian group was, I don't think it was an APT, I think it was just a criminal group, was sort of doxxed, and bounties were issued on these people. So, that's the cost of doing business now. You have $10 million on your head, and you're looking at your group of friends and relatives and thinking, how much do I trust these people?
Like with so many things, you start with the carrot and you end with the stick.
Absolutely, yeah. Behavior modification.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so, I'm talking to a lot of organizations and talking about threat modeling, and they're sort of wondering if they should be worried about APTs or not, because we're just this kind of shop and that kind of shop, and why would they care? But then there's supply chain attacks, then there's the element of opportunism. So I'm starting to get the feeling that most organizations, if not all out there, should be sort of maybe not worried about APTs, but thinking about them anyway.
If an organization is concerned with their reputation, their financial stability, intellectual property, then they need to take a proactive approach to security, because an APT may be interested. SolarWinds is obviously a huge example, and they're not a small organization, but you never know where you go, within a few short years from being a small organization to being a SolarWinds size organization.
Right. Yeah. And really, defending against an APT just means defending really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a security professional, I feel that organizations should be prioritizing their security.
Yeah.
It does seem like a no-brainer to me. And any defense that you can put in place is going to have some kind of an impact. Any protocols you can put in around patching, around, processes, training, all of this.
Yeah, the flip side of the coin of there being no magic bullet against APTs is that anything you do to sort of defend against APTs, you're also defending against everybody else out there. So you're just improving your cyber resilience in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I didn't want to be the one to wrap this up. Richard, do you have something to sort of bring us home?
Well, I think Stephen made a great point, is that defense against APTs is really the high-level defense and high-level security that you want to have in place for all attackers, against all attackers, and for your organization. And as previously mentioned, any threat, including APTs, can cause financial harm reputation harm, and other concerns for an organization. The larger the organization, the larger the target. So ultimately, until we've come up with a better way to wrangle the APT threat, organizations really need to be very proactive, defense in depth, as Stephen mentioned earlier, and be aware that if there is anything, even using their IP addresses as beachheads for other attacks, if there's anything that can be used within their technological property, it will be if an APT finds a way in or even perceives that organization as having value to the APT.
Perfect. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you guys for being with us today. And yeah, thank you for taking us through this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and ideas. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe.